children now were, so by the 19th century, the two very different coexisting views of children and childhood. And here this is towards the end of the century. As I said, this image of two, again, unidentified children who weren't necessarily wealthy by the look of their clothes and their setting. This wasn't, and certainly not an aristocratic family. This is a photograph, not a painting, so this is late 19th century. But these little girls' parents were, had a little bit of disposable income, so they'd probably be sort of lower to middle class parents, sufficient at least to buy their children clothes, to have toys for them, and of course to take their photograph for posterity. So here they are, two very serious little girls, no smiles at all, the holding dolls as if their little lives depended on it. This is the corruption at this point of the ways in which children were talked about, and the books, training books that now began to be written about them for parents, emphasised not so much their inherent corruptibility, but the fact that they could be corrupted from the outside. So children, especially little girls, were very vulnerable to the sorts of messages which might lead them from the straight and narrow, especially the straight and narrow of their gendered expectations that they should have become wives and mothers. So there really is, it's so different, this picture, from the painting of the three little children 2 generations before, where the little boy's throwing his hat for the dog and they're all sitting around like, their whole lives are just one level of delight. Here, I mean, you'd be really would not necessarily put this photograph, would you, of your children up to, because this is what would have been there for, to display your children to other people.
Is that even a funny crying one or anything?
No. They actually look terrified, the poor little things. It makes me a bit sad, really, because they do look quite frightened. And of course, and their parents would have been frightened on their behalf as well, because children were now seen to be at risk from society, as I said, and especially little girls. The double face of children, I said, as innocent and asexual, alongside the child as corrupt and corruptible. So there seemed to be quite a fine line between these two images of the child, and especially of girls. The role of children, I said, the ways, the norms and expectations of the child in its childhood reflected very much the sort of dominant social and political functions of the family at the time. And this is a sketch representation from a royal commission in the 19th century, from the middle of the century onwards. There were a whole series, the government put in place a whole series of inquiries about the treatment of children, which led up to the Education Act. I'm talking about the UK now, but in many ways these were paralleled in Australia, but a little bit later. There are a whole series, this anxiety about the child being at risk from the outside world began to be reflected in these sorts of royal commissions. There'll be like inquiries now, where individuals or groups of individuals were sent off to examine aspects of the child's life. And this one was children's employment in 1842. The report came out. And of course, in 1842, as we were saying, it was Dickens, but 42 is much earlier, the child could be working from the age of 4 or 5 years old and upwards, and often outside of the home. And here we see the evidence of, this is just a short extract, the labour, there's a point, this is actually taken from the report of 1842, the evidence of boys who are comparatively engaged in the same behaviour will be found most particularly to be of similar character. It's here worthy of remark that to this labour, which is at once so repulsive and severe, the girls are invariably set at an earlier age than boys are to their peculiar labour, from a notion very generally entertained amongst the parents themselves that girls are more acute and capable of making themselves useful at an earlier age than boys. And then they go and say the labour which children and young people are employed, next to the severity Next in severity is the sore slavery of coal bearing is coal putting, in which we find the sexes more equally distributed. So here are, in that long 19th century way of writing, here are two images of young people and children dragging lorries of coal, harnessed to lorries of coal and dragging them through very, very low, narrow tunnels in coal mines. Quite dreadful. You can imagine how many injuries occurred and how many children died doing this sort of work. But you can see also how education at this point was seen to be completely irrelevant. It wasn't, if you were poor, the most important thing, especially as far as the parents are concerned, is that the family survived. But these sorts of inquiries, gradually over the 19th century, the reports that came out were so shocking to the general populace that the government was forced to act. And so there was a series of restrictions placed on children. Children were taken out of mines altogether. Children remained working in factories, but only from the age of about 13, after about 1870s or so. The age of consent, which since the 16th century had been 13, so it was quite legal to have sex with a child of 13 up until 1863. Changed to 1886, I beg your pardon. Changed to 13 in 1863 and 16 in 1886. So, sorry, the age of consent was 10 before that, on my confusion. From the 16th century onwards, the age of consent was 10. In 1863, they raised that to 13.
How can you even know what consent is?
Well, yes. Yes.
So many mothers died giving birth because they would have been probably 12.
Well, yes. You can imagine that trauma, pregnancy, rape, I mean, the lives of children were not, and childhood, and which is why I think this history is so striking, because it really does demonstrate that this thing called childhood really was a very had very tenuous meaning for most of our history. In the age of consent was raised finally for girls, not boys, in 1886 to 16 as a result of another expose, but this time by a newspaper editor, of the fact that girls were being sold to prostitution at the age of about 10 or 12. That's a link. Sorry, I couldn't get that to link. But that's the Baby Bow and Bell site.